She also appeared on Howard Stern, where he said he'd even vote for a wall. Harris replied, "I'm not a wall, but I am plastered."
Howard Stern just got absolutely destroyed on live television, and his response was nothing. Complete silence. The man who built his empire on never backing down from a fight just sat there and took it like a beaten dog. Greg Gutfeld didn't just roast him, he annihilated Stern. He dissected 20 years of hypocrisy in under 10 minutes using Stern's own words against him. And the most shocking part, everything Gutfeld said was absolutely true. This wasn't just a comedy bit, this was a public execution of a media legend. And we're about to break down exactly how it happened. Because what you're about to see reveals something much bigger than just one awkward interview moment. The shock jock king is dead, and his eliminator just happens to be the funniest man on television. Here's the thing that makes this destruction so devastating. Howard Stern built his entire empire on shock, rebellion, and tearing down the establishment. For decades, he was the guy who never backed down from anyone or anything. Celebrities, corporate executives, nobody was safe from his verbal A-rifle. But when Greg Gutfeld took aim, the king of controversy went completely radio silent. No comebacks, no fire, just awkward silence echoing louder than any words he could have spoken. In that stunning live segment, Gutfeld didn't just call out Stern's evolution, he exposed it as a full-blown sellout. The rebel had become the very system he once destroyed, and Gutfeld lit the match that burned it all down. What happens when the supposedly uncensored icon gets out-rebelled on his own turf? Apparently, he just sits there and takes it like a neutered house cat. But here's how far Stern has fallen. This is a man who can call snacking with celebrities at fancy restaurants exhausting.
I really had an exhausting weekend. Emotionally, physically. For the first time in 2 years, I ventured out of the house. Now, maybe he's exaggerating. We all do that. In fact, the more successful you get in media, the more exhausting the easiest things become. This is true.
Exhausting? Like he just finished an overnight shift in a coal mine? Or had to listen to someone talk about their pets for 3 hours straight? I mean, I get it. Life is tough, especially when you've been cut off from the world for 2 years in a $20 million beach house. You have no idea how tiring it is walking all the way from the wine cellar to the tennis court and back. This wasn't just comedy, it was a cultural autopsy. Gutfeld was performing surgery on a corpse that used to be one of the most fearless voices in media. The man who once made big names sweat was now sweating over dinner reservations. The transformation was complete, and Gutfeld made sure everyone could see exactly what Stern had become. A pampered, out-of-touch millionaire complaining about his first world problems while his former audience struggled with real ones. But the restaurant complaints were just the appetizer. Gutfeld was about to serve the main course. For 2 solid years, Howard Stern essentially vanished from civilization, broadcasting from what he proudly called his apocalypse bunker, the basement of his Southampton mansion. The man who built his career on fearless public engagement became so paranoid that he bragged about almost entirely avoiding breathing the same air as anyone else. Think about that. A guy who once thrived on human connection was now treating other people like biological weapons.
As far as I remember, when I went to school, you had to get a measles vaccine, you had to get a mumps vaccine, there was a ton of them you got.
Gutfeld saw right through this cowardice, noting how Stern being holed up in his house that long explains a lot of things. Like how you forget how other people live, especially in hard times like a pandemic. The isolation hadn't just made Stern physically weak, it had completely severed his connection to reality. But here's where Stern's transformation became truly disgusting. The man who spent decades fighting censorship suddenly became the most authoritarian voice on radio. His rants about vaccine mandates were so unhinged, they made Anthony Fauci look reasonable by comparison.
Maybe you should follow his next vaccine with a shot of Valium. But it's weird. He went from ridiculing the man to becoming him.
Stern's demands for mandatory medical compliance represented the complete opposite of everything he once stood for. This was the same guy who fought the FCC for years over free speech, now demanding forcing unidentified needles into people's arms. The hypocrisy was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Gutfeld's surgical response exposed the absurdity perfectly, suggesting Stern needed sedatives to calm his hysteria. The mockery was devastating because it highlighted how far the former rebel had fallen into authoritarian madness. Stern's F-streak reached its disgusting peak when he demanded that people with different medical views be left to die. His hospital ban demands weren't just policy disagreements, they were literal death wishes against fellow Americans who made different personal choices.
When are we going to stop putting up with the idiots in this country and just say, it's mandatory to get vaccinated? Fuck them, fuck their freedom. I want my freedom to live.
This wasn't the voice of reason. This was a shrieking of a broken man who had lost all perspective. The rebel who once defended everyone's right to make their own choices was now demanding government punishment for those who chose differently. The transformation was complete and utterly repulsive. Gutfeld's most devastating observation was how Stern had become the very villain from his own movie, Pig Vomit. Was the rigid, authoritarian radio executive Stern once mocked mercilessly? Now, he had literally become that character, demanding compliance, punishing dissent, and enforcing orthodoxy from his ivory tower. The Howard Hughes comparison was equally brutal. Stern had transformed from a fearless cultural warrior into a paranoid recluse, making insane demands from his mansion bunker. The isolation had rotted his brain and destroyed his credibility entirely. The ultimate irony? After years of paranoid terror and authoritarian demands, Stern caught the very thing he was so afraid of anyway. All that fear, all that isolation, completely pointless. His credibility was already destroyed, but this final twist made him look like a complete fool. But if you want to understand just how far Howard Stern has fallen, you need to go back to April 21st, 1999, the day after the Columbine High School incident. This is where Stern crossed a line so disgusting that even his most loyal defenders couldn't stomach it. And it's exactly the kind of moment that Greg Gutfeld has been cataloging for years as evidence of Stern's complete moral bankruptcy. Picture this: 12 students and one teacher had just been emmed in cold blood. Families were grieving. A nation was in shock. And what did Howard Stern do? He got on the radio and wondered why the two who perpetrated this crime didn't essay the really good-looking girls, who were running for their lives with their hands over their heads. Let that sink in for a moment. While parents were identifying their children's remains, Stern was fantasizing about our scenarios involving teenage victims. His exact words were even more vile. If I was going to ill some people, I'd take them out with S. This wasn't edgy comedy. This was the deranged ramblings of a sick mind.
And Sunday will mark 26 years since one of the worst school shootings in American history. 2 students opened fire and set off explosives inside Columbine High School in Littleton, Colorado.
The reaction was swift and devastating. The Colorado General Assembly passed a resolution, 57-4, censuring Stern and demanding he apologize to Columbine High School. Think about that. An entire state legislature stopped what they were doing to formally condemn one radio host. That's how disgusting his comments were. Major advertisers fled like rats from a sinking ship. Geico, Direct Insurance, Amazon.com, and Snapple all pulled their sponsorships immediately. Even in an era where Stern was considered untouchable, this was too much for corporate America to stomach. The Denver Rocky Mountain News delivered a brutal editorial. Let Howard Stern make his millions in other broadcast markets. He does not belong in Denver. KTWB-TV in Seattle pulled his television show entirely. This wasn't just criticism. This was a coordinated effort to exile him from civilized society. Stern's response? He claimed his comments were taken out of context and that critics were being overly sensitive. He actually had the audacity to say he was trying to understand the motive behind the shooting, as if wondering about our scenarios was some kind of psychological analysis rather than the sick fantasies of a degenerate. This is the same pattern Gutfeld has observed throughout Stern's career. Make the most disgusting comments possible, then play victim when people call him out. It's the playbook of a coward who wants all the shock value with none of the responsibility. Here's what makes things even more damning. This is the same Howard Stern who now lectures everyone about morality and decency. The man who fantasized about R-ing teenage victims now positions himself as a moral authority. Gutfeld has been watching this hypocrisy for decades, noting how Stern demands accountability from everyone except himself. The Columbine comments weren't just a momentary lapse in judgment. They revealed the true character of a man who would exploit any tragedy for attention. And now that same man sits in his mansion, preaching about what's appropriate, while his own history reeks of the most inappropriate behavior imaginable. But if you think the Columbine comments were rock bottom for Howard Stern, You'd be wrong, because what Gutfeld has been documenting for years is a consistent pattern. Stern doesn't just cross lines, he seeks out the most vulnerable targets and destroys them for sport. And nowhere is this more evident than in his systematic attacks on women who couldn't fight back.
And there's the most enormous fat black chick I've ever seen,
my
like
goodness.
Gabrielle Sidibe.
Sidibe, or whatever her name is.
She is enormous. I mean, she is enormous. And you feel bad because
Everybody's pretending that she's a part of showbiz.
In March 2010, fresh off her Oscar nomination for Precious, 26-year-old actress Gabourey should have been celebrating the biggest moment of her career. Instead, she found herself in Howard Stern's crosshairs for the crime of being successful while not meeting his beauty standards.
everyone's pretending to be part of showbiz.
And that she's going to be around.
And she's never going to be in another movie. And she really should have gotten the Best Actress award because she's never going to have another show. What movie is she going to be in?
Stern's attack was methodical and vicious. He called her the most enormous fat black chick I've ever seen, and declared that everyone's pretending she's part of show business and she's never going to be in another movie. But he wasn't done. He suggested he should have won the Oscar because she's never going to have another shot, turning what should have been recognition of her talent into a pity prize. The R-ism was barely disguised. When asked what movie she should be possibly in next, Stern sneered. Blindside 2. She could be the football player. Take out the whole front line. This wasn't comedy. This was a 56-year-old man publicly humiliating a young black woman for daring to succeed in Hollywood while not conforming to his aesthetic preferences. Stern's cruelty reached new depths when he played Oprah Winfrey's encouraging words to Sidibe at the Oscars, then declared that Oprah was lying by telling the young actress she had a bright future. He called Oprah a filthy liar for telling an enormous woman the size of a planet that she's going to have a career. Think about the psychology behind this attack. Stern was so threatened by the idea of a successful black woman who didn't fit the conventional beauty standards that he had to tear down both her and her most prominent supporter. This wasn't shock jock humor. This was the behavior of a deeply insecure man lashing out at anyone who challenged his narrow worldview. When Sidibe's mother, Alice Tan Ridley, was asked to respond to Stern's attacks, her dignity stood in the stark contrast to his cruelty. He can see, you can see, I can see Gabby is a big girl, she said. She's a big woman, so what's wrong with that? She's not like everyone else in the world. Her most devastating comeback was simple and perfect. I don't see him giving jobs out to anybody, so why should we care what he says? He might not hire her, but someone else will. The mother's grace exposed Stern's irrelevance while defending her daughter's humanity. But Stern's cruelty wasn't limited to young actresses. In 2008, he targeted one of America's most beloved entertainers in what can only be described as audio tea. His team took Dolly Parton's audiobook, her own voice reading of her own memoir, and spliced it together to make it sound like she was making R-ist comments and inappropriate remarks about young boys.
Obviously, these comments make her sound very naughty.
You were going to say defamation. I didn't say that. You made that up. You morphed it. And of course, he's going to say it's satire. But the problem is,
This wasn't just editing for comedy. This was deliberate character A. They made it appear that the 62-year-old country music legend was using R slurs and making S comments about children. The violation was so profound that Parton, known for her gracious nature, was driven to consider legal action. Parton said in a statement, "I have never been so shocked, hurt, and humiliated in all my life. I cannot believe what Howard Stern has done to me. In a blue million years, I would never have such vulgar things come out of my mouth." The pain in her words was evident. This wasn't just professional damage, it was personal devastation. Stern's response to Parton's anguish revealed everything about his character. When confronted with the pain he had caused, he showed no remorse whatsoever. "It's an absurd bit," he said dismissively. "It's obviously parody, and it's funny as hell." When threatened with a lawsuit, his response was even more telling. "I can't even imagine someone thinking that they have an actionable case. But bring it on." This is the behavior of a sociopath, causing deliberate pain to vulnerable people, then mocking them for being hurt by it. There was no comedy here, no social commentary, no artistic merit. Just a powerful man using his platform to destroy people who couldn't fight back. What makes these attacks even more damning is that they reveal the complete opposite of everything Stern claims to represent now. The man who now lectures about compassion and social justice spent decades targeting women, minorities, and anyone who didn't fit his narrow definition of acceptable. Gutfeld has been cataloging this hypocrisy for years. noting how Stern's current moral preening is built on a foundation of systematic cruelty. The most damning part? Both Sidibe and Parton proved Stern completely wrong. Sidibe has had a successful 15-year career in film and television, while Parton remains one of America's most beloved entertainers. Stern's predictions were as worthless as his character. These weren't isolated incidents, they were part of a deliberate pattern. Stern consistently targeted people who couldn't fight back. Young actresses, beloved entertainers, grieving families, anyone vulnerable enough to be hurt by his attacks. This wasn't rebellion, this was pedantry behavior disguised as entertainment. But if you want to see the absolute rock bottom of Howard Stern's moral bankruptcy, we need to go back to 1992, the year he made comments so vile that the feds hit him with one of the largest broadcasting fines in history. This is the moment that should have ended his career, but instead became just another stepping stone in his rise to fame. On a routine broadcast in 1992, Stern decided to share his twisted S fantasies with his audience. His exact words were, "The closest I ever came to making love to a black woman was I emmed to a picture of Aunt Jemima on a pancake box. I did it right on her kerchief." Let that sink in. A grown man on national radio describing an S-act involving an R-ist caricature that had already been recognized as deeply offensive to the black community. This wasn't just shock value. This was deliberate racial humiliation broadcast to millions of listeners. The Aunt Jemima character was rooted in the mammy stereotype from minstrel shows, representing one of the most degrading images in American racial history. Stern knew exactly what he was doing when he chose this particular target for his twisted fantasy. The FCC's response was swift and devastating. They slapped Stern and his employer, Infinity Broadcasting, with a $600,000 fine, one of the largest indecency penalties ever used at the time. To put this in perspective, most FCC fines in the early 90s were measured in thousands, not hundreds of thousands. This fine was a clear message that Stern had crossed a line that even the notoriously permissive broadcasting standards couldn't tolerate. Now that Gutfeld has torn the mask off Howard Stern in real time, the floodgates have opened. People are digging into Stern's sordid past with a vengeance. And these incidents we've covered, the Columbine fantasies, the racist Aunt Jemima comments, the cruel attacks on Gabourey, Sidibe, and Dolly Parton, these are just the tip of the iceberg. There's decades more buried in his archives waiting to be unearthed by an army of internet investigators who smell blood in the water. If everything were to come out, every vile comment, every cruel attack, every moment of moral bankruptcy, Howard's entire empire would collapse overnight like a house of cards in a hurricane.